Great. Well, thanks everybody for having me today. And it's great to follow two excellent presentations that I thought were really interesting. So today I'm going to talk about my paper called Labor Market Design Can Improve Match Outcomes, Evidence for Matching Teach for America Teachers to Schools. So this paper is really motivated by this fact that economists are increasingly, and it's no surprise to anybody at this workshop, are increasingly redesigning markets. And later this afternoon, we'll have a policy table discussing a centralized market for economists potentially. So given that economists are increasingly redesigning markets, it's important to realize that especially with labor markets, we're often trying to solve some problem that has arisen in these markets when we implement the reforms. So for example, with the National Residency Matching Program, the market was unraveling in terms of hiring occurring earlier and earlier relative to the established start date of the position, and the centralized match successfully ends that early hiring. And as a result of this very public success of market design in these labor markets, we're increasingly seeing market design tools being adopted by school districts for student assignment, by organizations like the United States Army is adopting some of these tools. Organizations like Google and consulting firms like McKinsey are all using these tools because of their apparent success in redesigning these labor markets. But I'm going to ask the question of what is the impact on actual match quality of these centralized clearinghouses? So importantly, because they're designed to yield particular desirable properties like stability, for example, and they're not designed to increase to necessarily maximize social utility, it's important that we have empirical evidence about their impacts on overall match quality. Now, there is some prior evidence to date, but typically it's based on ex post research designs where a labor market changes mechanisms for some reason, and there's like a before and after comparison of market outcomes, for example, in the gastroenterology market. So in this paper, I'm going to present evidence from, and please let me know if you disagree with this, I believe this is one of the first field experiments to intentionally manipulate the matching mechanism in order to facilitate an evaluation on market outcomes. I'm just gonna go on. Cats, of course, start meowing as soon as you start presenting. So I worked with Teach for America, which is a large organization in the United States, which I'll describe more in the next slide, in the Chicago and Northwest Indiana region in the United States, to implement the school position proposing deferred acceptance algorithm. But importantly, the intervention was done in such a way that some markets where one market was matched using deferred acceptance, whereas the other market intentionally, because I worked with them to do this, maintained the old mechanism in order to facilitate this evaluation. So it's a field experiment in the sense that as a researcher, I implemented the design to facilitate the evaluation, but it's not a field experiment in the sense of a randomized controlled trial because we're just comparing one market to another. To preview the results, teachers were uniformly better off, almost universally uniformly better off, but the impact was more mixed for schools. So in the short run, there were some winners and losers among the schools. And across the 2 years that teachers commit to working with Teach for America, I see that their retention increased by 7.5 percentage points, which is a very important outcome for both the students they'll be teaching and for Teach for America. And one thing that's cool about this from the education literature's perspective is, in the United States at least, it's pretty unusual to match teachers to schools using a centralized assignment mechanism. So the preference information that comes from this is also potentially of interest. So I'll have more of that in the paper. I think that's probably of less interest to this group. Revealed preference suggests that deferred acceptance was better, and that's evidenced by the fact that Teach for America adopted it for all of their teachers in 2015 and 2016, the 2 years after I worked with them. So to give you a little bit more detail on my context, so Teach for America is a large national nonprofit organization in the United States that brings teachers or people who weren't necessarily planning to be teachers, high achieving individuals. it encourages them to become teachers in disadvantaged schools in urban and rural areas for at least 2 years. So to give you a sense of the scale, they operate in 53 regions. And in 2014, which was the year of the intervention, they had 5,300 teachers total in the program. Now, why should you care about Teach for America? Well, it's the largest single certifier of teachers in the United States. So they provide teachers with an alternative certification. These are people who weren't planning to become teachers otherwise. And the best evidence to date suggests they do a pretty good job. So there have been randomized controlled trials showing that they they're more effective, especially in math, than traditionally trained teachers. In Chicago, where the intervention took place, they account for Teach for America teachers account for 15 to 20% of all new teachers entering the school district. And why teacher labor markets are particularly interesting. There are 3.5 million full-time equivalent teachers in the United States, and teaching is the modal occupation of college graduates in the United States. So this is a huge and very important market. Now, to orient you to how Teach for America operates, a lot of their resources just go into recruiting really talented people to become teachers. So they had 50,000 applicants in 2014, which again is when I worked with them. And they spend on average $11,000 per teacher that they recruit and select. So getting these teachers that are accepted to stay for the full commitment is very valuable to Teach for America. They had 50,000 applications, but they're very selective in who they admit to the program. Their acceptance rate was 15% in 2014, and that was based on a writing exercise, a phone interview, and a day-long group interview with all these people. Now, an important aspect for my research design is that once you're accepted, you receive a region grade level subject area offer. So I'll show you an example of this later, but for example, you might be invited to be a high school science teacher in Chicago. So the markets are stratified based on these initial assignments. But because Teach for America is just a certification agency, they don't actually own a job for you. They have to help you match with a position in a school. So my intervention is going to take place with this matching between Teach for America teachers and positions in schools. Now, in order to facilitate this matching, Teach for America the Chicago region organizes a series of what they call interview days, which are essentially speed dating sessions between school leaders and teachers. So they have rolling admissions in each year. So they hold a series of 3 interview days over the course of usually between like February and June. And at each interview day, between 50 and 100 teachers and school leaders come together and have a series of 7 25-minute interviews. Now, because teachers can't match across markets, they're assigned to teach either high school or elementary school. They hold separate sessions for these 2 grade levels in order to manage the size of the interview days. So I'm going to be able to separately manipulate the matching mechanism for the high school and elementary markets. Now, the schedules of these teachers are only meeting a subset of schools, so the schedules are very important. They're made by a single Teach for America staff member. My perception from the schedules are not officially random, but it's very complicated to come up with a schedule for 100 teachers meeting 100 schools in a very short period of time. So based on my discussions with them, I view them as being basically random. Schools are given the resumes of the teachers they'll meet about a week or 2 before the interview day, and teachers learn the schedule of schools they'll meet at the interview day in like the half hour before interviews start. So just to show you what it looks like when someone is accepted, if you were an applicant to the 2015 core of Teach for America teachers and you were accepted, your assignment might have looked like this. So we're thrilled to invite you to join the 2015 Teach for America core. You have been assigned to teach high school science in Houston. So I show you this just to emphasize that it is a predetermined characteristic, whether you're going to be a high school teacher or an elementary school teacher. So if we change the matching market for one of them, there aren't going to be spillovers into the elementary market because they're stratified at baseline into either the high school or elementary school market. So my intervention and what I'm calling my field experiment was to implement deferred acceptance only in the high school interview days. So for the elementary market, and in all the markets before I started working with Teach for America, they used what I call the first offer mechanism. So nationally, Teach for America's goal is to put teachers in really disadvantaged schools that can be hard places to work. Now, in order to encourage teachers to go to these schools, they require that Teach for America teachers accept their first offer. So what they don't want is them basically waiting for a really desirable position, which is potentially not at a disadvantaged school, to come up. So they're required to accept their first offer. And this was true even within the 3.5 hours of an interview day. So if you're having your first interview with a school at 7:30 in the morning, and the school decides you're good enough and they give you an offer, you accept it and you exit the interview day. And your only choice if you're a teacher is to quit Teach for America or to go with this job. So they can't refuse without quitting Teach for America. So in a similar setting, it wasn't obviously specifically Teach for America, but thinking about firms with these dynamic incentives, Damiano, Lee, and Swen in a 2005 paper show that firms should use a threshold strategy here, which basically accounting for the fact that teachers are dynamically leaving the market, schools should basically have a decreasing quality threshold for teachers across each round. Now, in the high school market, after I started working with them, we implemented interview day matches using the school position proposing deferred acceptance algorithm. So it's a many-to-one match. Schools potentially are hiring multiple teachers. They were able to submit preferences for each of their positions that they were hiring for. So just like typical applications of deferred acceptance, all scheduled interviews occur. And so the full interview day runs through, and at the end of the day, schools submit their preferences over each of their positions. Teachers, the one substantial deviation from typical applications is that teachers still were not allowed to refuse an offer at a school. So they have to, Teach for America wants their teachers to go where they're needed. So teachers were required to rank all schools. Importantly, then, the only manipulations they could make are inverting the ordering of them. They're not able to truncate their preference lists. They may have also had to rank some schools that were unacceptable as a result, though. So not all teachers attend an interview day. So Teach for America recruits potentially internationally, but certainly from across the country. And these are all held in Chicago. So some teachers just aren't able to attend. Across 2014, when I worked with them, in the year before, you can see about 60% of high school teachers, a little bit more, attended any interview days, and slightly more elementary school teachers attended. And about 40 to 50% of high school teachers were hired at interview days, despite their lower attendance, and about 1 in 4 elementary school teachers. So this isn't the only way teachers could be matched. If they were matched outside of an interview day, it was facilitated by a Teach for America staff member setting up basically one-on-one in-person or phone interviews or something like a Zoom interview with the teacher. So it's very costly for Teach for America to facilitate the matching outside of the interview day system. So,
Jonathan,
yes.
Can I ask you a very short question? Which is the information that teachers have about DA, about how the mechanism is performed and the rules and things like that? So
basically at the beginning of the interview day, they had me come up and stand in front of them. So I explained that it's very likely that it's in their best interest to truthfully report their preferences. In principle, there could be some very complicated manipulations if they had perfect information. But then I explained that there would be an algorithm that runs on the computer and that it's been used in other markets. So they did not have a ton of information about how it would work, but they were encouraged to truthfully report their preferences. So in terms of what the impact of this intervention was, so I'll first look at I'm going to use two approaches. So, and they're driven in part by the data that's available to me. So I'll measure short-term, like immediate impacts based on outcomes that were determined at the time the match was determined, using interview day data, which includes interview schedules and teachers' rankings over the schools they meet with. And for schools, I observed their rankings over teachers they were willing to hire, and then I can infer that they preferred those teachers to teachers they weren't willing to hire. And then in a few slides, I'll show you longer term outcomes using difference in difference type methods, where I have data that goes back further in time. So just a quick fact about the preferences that I think is quite interesting and will motivate how I'm going to measure the immediate impacts. There's very high vertical alignment in preferences of teachers in schools. So I have incomplete preferences, but whenever two schools rank or decisively rank one teacher against another, either by ranking one and not ranking the other or ranking them subsequently, they agree on the relative ranking 80% of the time. And likewise for teachers, where I do basically I have much more complete preferences, when two teachers rank two schools, they agree on the relative ranking 78% of the time. So there's very high agreement about the relative ranking of people in this market. Now, there are two big differences between the first offer mechanism and deferred acceptance. So the first is that under first offer, schools essentially get priority based on the order in which they meet the teachers. So if you see the teacher in the first round, you're able to make that offer. And the teacher can't refuse it. So you basically get precedence based on the interview schedule. There are also the dynamic considerations about these threshold strategy. The threshold strategy that Damiano, Lee, and Swen show is the optimal behavior of schools in this situation. But given the very high correlation, that actually is going to make the threshold fall very quickly to the final round threshold, because schools will anticipate that any teacher that they want to hire is being interviewed by another school that would also like to hire them and will likely have left the market by the time they see them in later rounds. So I'm going to focus on just the difference in the precedence that schools get over teachers. So under the first offer mechanism, the interview order distinguish if multiple schools would like to hire a teacher, the interview order breaks the tie between those schools. Whereas under deferred acceptance, the teacher's preferences breaks the ties if multiple schools would like to hire one teacher. So I basically simulate this by running deferred acceptance using the interview order instead of the teacher's preferences. And as a result, I observe deferred acceptance and the first offer mechanism for all teachers in schools. So when I say that teachers are basically uniformly better off, if I compare teachers, the average rank of their match from first offer mechanism versus deferred acceptance, you can see very, very few teachers are worse off on average based on their ranking of the school they're matching with. About half get the same match, which would be the case if only one school is willing to hire them. But many teachers are matching with a school they rank at least one full position better, and some as many as 3 to 3.5 positions better. For schools, there are multiple ways I can look at if schools are better or worse off. But if I compare just the number of hires they're making, some schools get more hires under deferred acceptance, which schools would be happy about. Again, many get the same outcome, but there is a not insubstantial, about 1 in 4 schools get fewer hires under deferred acceptance, and we're hurt by this. So teachers were given much more autonomy under deferred acceptance, and not surprisingly, they were much happier with their matches at the end of the day, whereas there were more winners and losers among schools. Now, my main longer run outcome that I'll look at is retention through the teacher's 2-year commitment to Teach for America. Now, stability is often it is the desirable property motivating deferred acceptance. So retention is kind of like the ex post counterpart to the immediate stability that deferred acceptance generates. And there's a real question whether matches that are stable based on ex ante preference reports will remain stable once workers start to position and have more information about how much they like it. As I mentioned, Teach for America spends quite a lot of money recruiting each teacher. So it's also quite valuable for them to keep these teachers for their 2 years commitment. Now, one common reaction is that it's really obvious that deferred acceptance is going to yield higher retention because teachers had almost no autonomy under the old system or shifting to something where their preferences are selecting what their match is. But this isn't guaranteed to increase retention. It's very intuitive that it might, but if the teachers that are most preferred, so are ranked the highest under deferred acceptance and benefit the most, were the least likely to leave, whereas the less preferred teachers might be more marginal, like they're not sure they want to stay in teaching, shifting to advantaging those more preferred teachers could actually push the less preferred teachers to quit. So there's no theoretical guarantee that deferred acceptance will increase retention. So in particular, if school preferences are negatively correlated with teachers outside options, it could actually increase attrition and decrease retention. And also ex ante and ex post preference reports could be quite different. So to look at this, I have data going back 6 years prior to the intervention. So data from or 6 years of data, 5 years pre-intervention. And Teach for America provided me with data from 3 comparison regions that were selected to be comparable to Chicago in terms of the size of the region, the size of the city they were in. So Teach for America selected these and provided them to me. They weren't willing to provide all 53 regions of data. So in the paper, I use 3 difference in difference strategies. Just a standard difference in difference comparing high school to elementary in Chicago, a triple difference showing the Chicago high school elementary school difference compared to the comparison regions. And what I consider to be the most credible is the synthetic control, where we basically use a data generated comparison group, which is what I'll show you next. So the synthetic control, it's not guaranteed to match like this, but it happens to, in the pre-intervention period, which is 2009 to 2013, there is a synthetic control included on this graph. It's just right under the treatment group. So we are able to match the pre-trends perfectly. And you can see that based on that comparison, the synthetic comparison, we would have predicted that retention would have continued to decline as it was falling as it was falling beforehand. But instead, we see this uptick that implies that matching with deferred acceptance caused a 7.5 percentage point increase in retention. Now, the way that you conduct inference with this synthetic controller is to compare the ratio of the post-period to the pre-period root mean squared error of the predictions. So this is the distribution among the donor markets. So each donor market is the high school or elementary group in the other regions. And if I add Chicago to this, the orange donor bars are right at 0. If you can see, the x-axis went to 3, whereas with Chicago, it's a far outlier, suggesting that this is unlikely to be driven by noise. The results are similar. Yep.
Can you just sum up in 1 minute?
Okay, I'm on almost my last slide. The results look similar, though, if I use the other difference in difference. There's no evidence that teachers are just working in easier schools because of this, so it doesn't seem like there's an impact on sorting. So this seems to have benefited teachers. Unfortunately, I can't say much about their performance because of data limitations. And if anything, there's a small, if any, increase in teachers' reported satisfaction once they were actually working in the match. So just an advertisement for future work. I'm building on this by running a full-scale randomized controlled trial with the United States Army. So I'm excited to have the real RCT coming in the next couple of years. Thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to chatting later. Thank you.